Hi class, welcome to our lecture on Chapter 13, Monetary Policy. Let's begin our discussion with the Bank of Canada. The Bank of Canada is the institution that delivers monetary policy in Canada. So it's the moving force behind Canada's monetary policy, and it has served as Canada's central bank since 1935, so quite some time. And its principal role is to promote the economic and financial welfare of Canada, and that's defined in the Bank of Canada Act. Now, the Bank of Canada is a wholly government-owned institution, and its directors and governor are appointed by the federal cabinet. Currently, the governor of the Bank of Canada is Tiff Macklem, and he replaced the former Bank of Canada governor Stephen Poloz. The Bank of Canada has four basic functions. First, it manages the money supply. So it conducts monetary policy by controlling the amount of money circulating in the economy. And not only does it issue paper currency, but more importantly, it affects the activities of chartered banks in similar institutions called nearbank. And so it can vary the supply of money and interest. So in managing the money supply, the bank is concerned with three main goals: minimizing inflation to preserve the purchasing power of the dollar, maintaining real output as close as possible to its potential, and to regulate the external value of the Canadian dollar in foreign exchange markets. The second function is that it acts as the banker's bank. So the commercial banks hold deposits at the Bank of Canada, and they're members of the Canadian Payments Association. And so the Bank of Canada makes advances or loans to CPA members at the bank rate. So that's the interest rate that commercial banks would have to pay. Thirdly, it acts as the federal government's fiscal agent. So it's like the bank for the federal government. It holds some of the government's bank's deposits, it clears government checks, and it handles the financing of the government's debt by issuing bonds. And these include Canadian savings bonds and treasury. Or it helps supervise the operations of financial markets to ensure their stability. So the central bank in Canada works in conjunction with the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, and then also make sure that everyone is following global guidelines, for example, the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. The success of Canada's financial supervision has received considerable attention since 2008 finance. Let's do some active learning questions. So if you want to hit pause and then resume, and I'll let you know the answer. So the question here is, which phase best describes the Bank of Canada? Okay, so hit pause. Okay, I'm back. So the correct answer is B. It's a government-owned central bank, and its main goal is to control the money supply and thereby help promote general economic wealth. So this is the best answer that fits what we just learned. Next question. Which of the following is not one of the four major functions of the Bank of Canada? Hit pause. Okay, I'm back. And so the answer here is A, managing the economy's supply of goods and services. We know that that's not done by the government. For the most part, the goods and services are provided in a market system. So Canada and the financial crisis. So Canadian financial institutions were less affected by the financial crisis than many other industrialized countries. What is the reason for that? Well, Canadian financial regulators had banned high-risk mortgage lending, and that's what got the U.S. into trouble. This relates to basically in the U.S., anyone who could breathe would be able to get a mortgage in the period prior to the financial crisis, and this led to a lot of mortgages being held by people who were probably not able to maintain them. But in Canada, we didn't have such a situation. Also, Canadian banks are engaged in far less risky behavior than many of their global counterparts, so we don't trade things like risky derivatives or mortgage-backed securities. Canada's large banks had lower leverage ratios than many of their global counterparts. So a leverage ratio just means if roughly it's looking at the amount of debt you have to your income or something like that. And so Canadian banks were in a fantastic financial situation before the financial crisis. And the Canadian property market did not succumb to the same bubble conditions that were present in other countries, especially the US. Okay, so let's talk about monetary policy. So monetary policy relates to how a country's central bank governs the supply of money and interest rates in an economy in order to influence output, employment, and prices. And so monetary policy can be used to smooth out the business cycle. So recall that monetary policy involves the Bank of Canada changing interest rates, altering the money supply, or both. And they do this in order to stabilize the economy, and in other words, smooth out the business cycle. And so the analysis we did in the last chapter of money and deposit money, we looked at the money market, and then we also looked at the money creation process. And so this allows us, this is important background in terms of understanding how monetary policy is conducted. So monetary policy, obviously, just like financial or fiscal policy, can be either expansionary or contract. It depends on, where the economy is. If you're in a recession and actual GDP is below potential, then we would want an expansionary monetary policy, just like we would want a fiscal or a fiscal policy that is expansionary. And obviously, if the economy is beginning to overheat, if we're operating above our potential GDP, then we would want contractionary fiscal policy and monetary policy. So expansionary monetary policy. And so we would be interested in such a policy, as I said, when output is far below the potential output. In other words, we have a recessionary gap. And so if that's the case, if we are in that type of a situation, then the Bank of Canada will use an expansionary monetary policy to stimulate the economy and to increase GDP, incomes, and employment. And the aim, obviously, is to close this gap. So such a policy is also referred to as an easy money policy. So essentially, if you just think about the supply of money, if it is, if it's lower, all else constant, that would make the price of money more expensive, just like any other market. And the price of money is the interest rate, which represents the opportunity cost of holding money. And so in the case of an easy money policy, we would be thinking the other way around, where the supply would be really high and we would have low interest rates. So this would be a policy of increasing the money supply and lowering the interest rate, because this will stimulate the economy. Interest rates are the cost of credit. We use credit, consumers and businesses. Consumers use it to buy durable goods, automobiles, things like that. And businesses will use borrowing to finance expansion plans or any type of investment in capital goods. Any expansion plans in general are commonly funded by borrowing. And so if it's cheaper to borrow, it's more likely that consumers will buy more durable goods and businesses will invest. And so we would represent this with a shift to the right in the aggregate demand. Okay, so note that there's a typo here. So I've now fixed the typo. Make sure you fix that in your lecture notes. So this would shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, and it would actually shift more than it depends on how much banks will lend out, if you remember the money creation process. But the end effect is that the aggregate demand curve would shift to the right. And this would be because there would be an increase in investment and consumption. And again, here, note that I just also fixed the typo that said decrease to inks. Okay, so if you remember, we talked about the spending multiplier before. So the change in aggregate demand or total spending is found by calculating the product of the spending multiplier and the initial spending change. And so the total change in output or shift in the aggregate demand curve is going to be equal to the initial change. So think of an injection into the circular flow. It would be that initial injection times a spending multiplier, okay? Because you're not just going to have that initial injection, because people will respend the income that they get according to the marginal propensity to consume. So suppose, for example, that there's a increase in investment and consumption that totaled $9 billion, and the value of the economy spending multiplier is 1.67. So we're thinking here that there is some change in monetary policy that would stimulate an increase in investment and consumption, and that value is about $9 billion. Well, that $9 billion is going to become income to people, and they're going to spend it. That will become income to people. They're going to spend it, and so on. So there is this multiplier, and if we suppose it's 1.67, then the end result will end up being 15 billion. And so the total change in aggregate demand would then be 15 billion. And remember, though, that that's how much the aggregate demand curve would shift to the right. But remember, the new equilibrium will be where aggregate demand equals the short-run aggregate supply curve. And so because you're allowing prices to increase up along the short-run aggregate supply curve, the increase will not be as high as 15 billion. It depends on the slope of the aggregate supply. So, for example, suppose we are at point A in the money market. Okay, so we're in equilibrium, and let's suppose our economy is in a recession, so we have a recessionary gap. We want to be at 800, but we're at 790. The Bank of Canada could increase the money supply, and that would shift we would represent that with a shift to the right. So the money supply curve is just a vertical line. It's going to shift over to the right. In order for this market to clear, the interest rate needs to fall. And so interest rates are pushed down from point A to point B. Now, this is going to initiate more spending among consumers and businesses in the form of investment. And if we assume that, the ongoing example of a multiplier 1.67, and we assume that this fall in the interest rate generates $9 billion of initial spending, then the aggregate demand curve will shift over by 15 billion, and that's because of the multiplier effect. So it initially is 9 billion, but then the end result of the multiplier will bring it up to 15 billion. However, it's not going to end there. The prices are allowed to increase. So as the economy experiences this increase in demand, we're assuming there'll be a little bit of a price increase, and that price increase will reduce the amount of spending. And so the new short run equilibrium will be at point D here at 800. And so here we have a situation where we're able to plan everything out perfect. The government knew that if they increased the money supply by this amount, that would lead to a 1 percentage point decrease in the interest rate. And then they knew that would, initiate $9 billion worth of spending. And then that would blow up into 15 billion, but then be offset by higher prices. And we'd end up exactly at the potential output. So when real output exceeds its potential level, there's an inflationary gap, as we know. And so in this case, the Bank of Canada would use contractionary monetary policy to reduce output. And so everything here is just going to be in reverse. We call this type of policy a tight money policy because we're going to be reducing the money supply, and this will lead to higher interest rates. Okay, so the goal here is to, the economy is overheating. We don't like inflation, so we're going to slow that down a bit. And so this would shift the aggregate demand curve left by a magnified amount, again, because of the multiplier. And so if we look at a diagram, so everything's, it's the same idea as the previous graphs, except here we're just doing the opposite policy. So here we're beginning in an inflationary gap. We don't like that. We want to be at potential output. And so we need to increase the interest rate or lower the money supply. So here we do that. And then as a result, this will shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. Okay, so suppose that we have the same $9 billion, so here the lower interest rate will reduce consumption spending and investment spending by $9 billion. Okay, and so that will fall because of the higher interest rate. And that will lead us to go from point E here to point C. But we're not going to go all the way to point C because we got to look at where the new aggregate demand curve would intersect the aggregate supply curve. And in this case, we, don't go nearly as far as C. We end up here at 800 billion, and that's where we want to be. So this again would assume that the government could accurately predict everything. And that's very hard because think about predicting. So a lot of the money supply, the issue with the money supply is the government can do things to change it, but ultimately they can't control what the commercial banks do in terms of their lending. And as we saw in the last chapter, that lending is part of, that's part of the money creation process. And so since the Bank of Canada doesn't control that, they can only sort of estimate the effect of what they're doing on the money supply. So, and we'll learn one way that they do that. So actually they tend to focus more on what interest rate they want rather than a dollar value of the money supply. So they'll set up what's called the target interest rate, and then they'll accommodate that interest rate using using the money supply. But they're not targeting the money supply, they're targeting the interest rate, and then they're just going to fiddle around with the money supply until they get that interest rate that they want. And they have to fiddle around because they don't know exactly how the commercial banks will react, right? And how much lending and how much money will be created as part of the money creation process. Okay, so here's an active learning question. So what I want you to do now is hit pause and read the question over, and then we'll take up the answer, okay? Okay, so here in the tables, we have the nominal interest rate, we have the quantity demanded of money and the quantity supplied of money, okay? And we're told that an economy whose natural unemployment rate is estimated to be 7%. So the natural unemployment rate here is 7%. So at 7%, at a 7% interest rate, that's where you would have no cyclical unemployment. So let's suppose that the unemployment rate is 8.5% and a declining rate of inflation. So is this economy facing a recessionary or inflationary gap? should its central bank use a contractionary or expansionary monetary policy? Well, since the unemployment rate is higher than the natural rate, we must be in some type of a recession. Okay, so we would want to use expansionary monetary policy. And then so B asks us to identify the steps by which this monetary policy will affect the economy. So, as I said, the answer to A is that we are in a recessionary gap and we would want to use expansionary monetary policy. And so, with expansionary monetary policy, the Bank of Canada would purchase government bonds. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. They would purchase government bonds in order to raise banks' excess reserves. Okay, so essentially they're doing things so that banks have excess reserves and want to lend out more money and hence increase the money supply. And this would, basically the chain of events here would be as we discussed before. This would lead to increases in consumer and business investment, and that would be magnified by the spending multiplier, okay? And so the end result would be a shift in the aggregate demand curve to the right by more than the initial amount that this lower interest rate would cause people to increase their spending, right? And so the end result, though, will be an increase in the equilibrium output and the price level. And hopefully it's done in a way that we're back to our potential output, okay? And so a policy like this would shrink the recessionary gap and then the unemployment rate would fall. Now in C, it says here to draw, a graph showing the demand for money. So the first two columns here, and then it's asking for, so we're going to draw these two, and then, so we're going to have two graphs. One's for the money market, and the other one will be our aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram. Okay, and so that will be in the price level and real GDP space. Okay, and then it's just asking us for the equilibrium interest rate in the money market and the initial equilibrium price level and real GDP. So for this part of the question, we would be here at point A. That's the intersection of the demand for money curve and the money supply. The first and the initial money supply, which is SM0. And so we would be at an interest rate of 3. The money supply would be $200 billion. And in terms of the overall economy, we're going to be here at point C. That's our aggregate demand curve. That's our aggregate supply curve. Okay. Now it says if monetary policy applied in part B leads to a $100 billion change in the money supply, then what is the new equilibrium interest rate? Add the new money supply curve to your graph. Okay. So this would be the new money supply curve. It's shifted to the right by 100 billion, and so the interest rate will fall by 1 percentage point. Okay, and so what will happen in the overall economy? Well, our aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right, and so we need some more information. So if the change in the interest rate in part D causes a $200 billion change in real expenditures at every price level, then what are the new equilibrium price level in GDP? So basically, we have some information now about how far the aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. So it will shift to the right by $200 billion. So the horizontal distance between any 2 points on these two curves is $200 billion. So our aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right. And so it's going to intersect the aggregate supply curve at a price level of 130 and real GDP will be 400. Okay. So the first sort of tool that the Bank of Canada has is called open market operation. And so the point of this is to increase or decrease the money supply. So if you think about it, all we're doing here, all the Bank of Canada is doing here is going onto the market and buying stuff like bonds, right? We won't get into too much of the details because, if they buy long-term bonds and they're affecting different interest rates, long-term versus short-term interest rates, they typically focus on short-term interest rates and buy government securities. So they can either buy or sell. So if they sell bonds, so they're going to go onto the market and sell bonds. And I mean, they'll adjust the price to whatever it needs to be in order to sell them. And so then the commercial banks will be, if the price is right, commercial banks will be interested in buying those. And so when a commercial bank buys those, or you could say, and it doesn't have to be a commercial bank, but a company could buy them or an individual. And the thing is, they'll they're going to have money at a commercial bank. And so when they buy this, they're going to now own this debt instrument, but they have to pay for it. And so money will be withdrawn from their accounts. So when the government or the Bank of Canada sells government securities on the open market, they're essentially pulling money out of the banking system. Okay, and so you have the money creation process working in reverse, and this will tend to lower the money supply. And then the reverse is when they purchase bonds, and so when they go on the market and buy a bunch of bonds, they have to pay for them, right? And so there's money now coming that wasn't in circulation from the Bank of Canada into the commercial banks, and they'll likely have excess reserves and they'll want to lend out money. Okay, and so and then if you remember the money multiplier will determine how much of an increase in the money supply you'll get in terms of a purchase, and in terms of a sale, the money multiplier just works in reverse. So here's an example of open market operations in terms of expanding the money supply. So below is a sequence of events when the central bank uses open market operations to expand the money supply. So we have the Bank of Canada, and then now we're going to introduce a person who holds a bond. So this is the owner of a bond. We call this person bondholder A. And we're going to say that the Bank of Canada buys a bond from a private bondholder A. Okay, so they're going to buy this instrument. So the Bank of Canada, after the transaction, is going to own this bond, and they got to pay for it. Okay, so the physical, the ownership of the bond goes to the Bank of Canada, and then in return, the Bank of Canada writes a check to the bondholder A. The bondholder is going to go to their commercial bank and deposit the check. And so the check is going to be presented to payment to the Bank of Canada, and then in return, the Bank of Canada is going to pay, honor the check. And so now the commercial bank will have increased reserves. And so the increased reserves, if the increased reserves are lent out, that's going to increase the money supply. So it's a simple process. And so the sale of a bond would just be everything in reverse. Okay, so another active learning question. So suppose the Bank of Canada buys a $10,000 bond from a member of the public when the reserve ratio in the banking system is 5%. Outline the effects on this bond purchase on each of the following variables. Okay, so you might want to hit pause for each one and try and guess what the answer is. So hit pause. Okay, so for A, the bond seller's bank deposit. Okay, so we're thinking of, the amount of money in the account at the commercial bank of the bond seller. Well, it's going to increase by $10,000, right? Because they're selling their bond to the Bank of Canada. Now, the second one is the desired reserves at the bond seller's bank. Okay, so hit pause. Okay, so what's the answer to this? Well, in B, we see that the answer is the bank's desired reserves will rise by 500. And here we're getting this figure just by multiplying 10,000 times the reserve ratio. So they're going to want to lend out the rest. And so I'll just continue because they're related. So for C, the bank's excess reserves will increase by 9,500. Okay, they want to keep, according to their reserve ratio, 500, but they have excess reserves of the rest. And so if they, follow the reserve ratio, then they'll want to lend out this money. And in D, it's saying, what is the maximum increase in the money supply? So if it's all lent out, the maximum increase would be $200,000. And that's found by adding the initial $10,000 rise in the money supply due to the expansion in the bond seller's bank deposit to the maximum $190,000 increase in the money supply due to the rise in excess reserves multiplied by the money multiplier. Okay, so we have excess, the initial excess reserves is 9,500. We multiply that by the money multiplier, and that gives us 190,000. But we just need to remember to add the $10,000 initial purchase to that amount, because this is new money into the system because it's coming from the Bank of Canada. Okay, it wasn't money that was already in circulation. If it was money that was already in circulation, then, we wouldn't include it. Okay, so, again, the answer is 200,000. So we're taking the sum of 10,000 plus 190,000. Okay, so now the second tool is called targeting the overnight interest rate. And I mean, the tool we just learned of open market operations is used for this tool as well. So these two tools aren't completely separate. So commercial banks routinely borrow and lend money overnight among themselves in order to cover their net shortfalls or surpluses from transactions during the day, right? People, some people write checks from the Royal Bank, and then whoever they wrote the check to will cash the check. And, some banks will, at the end of the day, in order to settle up, some might owe money, some might have excess money. And so this creates an overnight market for excess funds, or if you don't have enough. So there's a supply and demand of funds in this overnight market. And again, at the end of the day, they need to settle with each other. So one bank may have funds left over while another bank may need money. And so this creates a market, right? If the banks that have money left over can supply that, and other banks who need money will demand that, right? So you have supply and demand. It's a market, just a very short-term overnight market for one day loans. And so the price in this market is the overnight interest rate. And so that's the Bank of Canada's key policy rate. So 8 times a year, the Bank of Canada announces what its target rate is. So notice how they aren't exactly in effect, they're controlling it and deciding what the interest rate should be, but it's indirect, right? It's a market still, right? And so the participants in the market are the commercial banks, and they're, engaging in voluntary trade with each other in terms of these overnight funds. So the Bank of Canada, what it does is it, determines what its target rate is. And, if the economy is overheating, then it'll want to increase the target rate. If you're in a recession, it would want to lower the target rate. And so what it does is it actually provides a band in which it wants the target rate to be within. So it's not exactly, so it does, so they announce a target, but what they do is they change the bank rate and the banker's deposit rate around that target rate. And so they have a range of 50 basis points. So 25 basis points above and 25 basis points below. And we'll see that on the next slide. Okay, so the bank keeps the overnight rate near the target overnight rate by using tool number 1, which is open market operation. So this is the operating band. So if the target interest rate is 2.5%, then the Bank of Canada will set the bank rate at 25 basis points higher. This is the money that commercial banks will have to, this is the interest rate they'd have to pay for borrowing money. Okay, so this puts a maximum on what the rate is that they would need to borrow money. They can always borrow money for 2.75% from the Bank of Canada, so they're not going to, pay any more than that, okay? But if within the market they want to trade with each other at something lower, that's fine. Okay, so the bank rate is the rate that the commercial banks pay to the Bank of Canada on loans to cover a shortfall in reserves. Again, that's we're thinking at the end of the day, some will have excess funds and some will have a shortfall and they need to settle up. And so that's the overnight market. And so those who need to, those who are under by the end of the day and need to borrow money, they can borrow at 2.75%. So that's the most they would ever pay. But, maybe there's another commercial bank that would lend them the money for 2.6%. And so they'll take that over the bank rate. So the bank rate is just a sort of a cap on the overnight interest rate. It can never get higher than this because no commercial bank would want to pay more of an interest rate if they can always get 2.75%. And at the bottom, we have what's called the banker's deposit rate. And this is the amount that the Bank of Canada pays to people with excess funds. Okay, so this is the rate that the Bank of Canada pays the commercial banks on deposits of excess reserve. And so no commercial banks would accept anything less than this. Okay, and so this is what they do. They basically confine the overnight market into this operating band, and the commercial banks trade with each other in this band. If it starts getting up maybe towards the bank rate or towards the banker's deposit rate, the amount that they're trading with each other, then the Bank of Canada will use open market operations to, bump it back to the target, right? So if there are a lot of commercial banks with, say, excess reserves, then the interest rate might start falling towards this banker's deposit rate. And so the Bank of Canada then would try and, would probably sell government securities in order to reduce the excess reserves at the banks, so that, you know, it has the effect of increasing the interest rate. So they're going to use open market operations to try and make sure this market is trading as best as possible towards this overnight rate. And then this overnight rate is sort of it's also called a trend setting rate. So the lower this is, the lower other interest rates in the economy tend to be, right? If this is very low, then that'll translate into lower mortgage rates, etc. And you can always visit the Bank of Canada to see what the current rate is at. Let me open up a website here. Okay, so here is the Bank of Canada's website, and rate here, one of the first things you see is the policy interest rate. This is the overnight rate, and so it's extremely low now, obviously, given the situation that we're in with COVID-19. So it's at 0.25%, and if we click on this, we can see that it was up to 1.75% before this coronavirus started to have an impact. And we can get more data, so we can look at, we can go back. This will only let us go back 2010 at the latest. So we'll do that, and then we'll go to today, and we'll pick, we just want the target for the overnight rate, so we can actually get what the actual is too. And we click submit, and hopefully it'll give us a graph. No, it gives us the data. But anyways, that's fine. I don't know, see if there's any option for a graph that would be a little nicer to look at. No, I don't know why they don't have a graph for this. What we can do though is we can open it up in an Excel file, quickly plot it. So I'm just going to plot the overnight rate. Okay, and we can see that here. So back in 2010, it was around 1%. We had a little bit of issues here. Maybe I remember there might have been some minor concerns about the economy, so it was lowered a little bit, and then it started going back up. We were at 1.75, and then the coronavirus hit, and then they dropped it again, obviously to stimulate the economy because of the whole situation with the COVID-19 virus. We can add the second, we might as well add the second one. So the second series here is the actual overnight rate. So that's their target, and then this is what it actually was. And so I'm just going to insert the dates here again so I can plot them. Find where graph is here. I think I may have accidentally deleted it. So what I'll do is highlight both of these. Oh, there's my graph right there. Oh, that didn't turn out too well. Actually, I think what I can do is just add this, yeah. I'm not sure why it's drawing these lines down, but you can see that, the actual rate is very close to the real rate. You can just see here, looking at the values, that they're all very close to the actual. So anyways, that's the overnight rate. Let's go back to our PowerPoint presentation here. And actually, this is a graph here of what I was just looking at, except it doesn't go up to 2020. But you can see we have this is the prime interest rate in the economy, and so you can see it's highly correlated with the overnight rate, except it's, a couple percentage points or more higher throughout. This is the blue line is the overnight rate. That's the actual rate, and then the dotted line here that's very close to that blue line is the actual target. And so you can see here there was some deviation from the target, but for the most part, the target interest rate is very similar to the actual overnight rate. And this other dotted line here is the bank rate, so it can't go above that. Okay, so changing the overnight rate is a tool the Bank of Canada uses to signify its monetary policy intentions. So when it changes its target band for the overnight rate, it's automatically adjusting that bank rate and the banker's deposit rate. So that's the story with the overnight rate. And why do we care? Well, the rate is a signal. A rise in the overnight rate signifies a contractionary policy. A fall in the target overnight rate signifies an expansionary monetary policy. And if the change in the target overnight rate is substantial, then banks and other deposit takers also adjust their prime rate. And we saw that in the diagram there, that the prime rate was highly correlated with the overnight rate, except that it's, it's 2 to 3% percentage points higher. Okay, so you can think of the target rate as sort of a benchmark in which other interest rates in the economy are based off. And again, the interest rate is the price of credit, and the reason why a lower interest rate stimulates the economy is because credit is cheaper now. And so that makes people more, consumers are more willing to buy durable goods or big ticket items, or they would borrow money for, and businesses would be more likely to increase their investment. Okay, so lower interest rates stimulate the economy, higher interest rates slow the economy down. Now let's talk about the different types of inflation. So there are two main types of inflation: demand pull inflation, and this occurs as rightward shifts in the aggregate demand curve as they pull up prices. So demand pull inflation is just the situation where you have aggregate demand increasing and that's causing prices to increase. And that could happen if in some markets, because of this increase in demand, there might be some temporary shortages which lead to higher prices. And you can think economy-wide that might happen here and there, and so you would get some inflation. And if you're around potential output, if the economy is operating at its potential and there's and aggregate demand is stimulated, then this could lead to much higher inflation, because you can think of many markets having shortages. You're in a situation where what people want is exceeding the economy's ability to produce it. And so what's going to happen is prices just get bid up. Cost push inflation is much different. It occurs as a leftward shift in the aggregate supply curve and pushes up prices. So this could be, the aggregate supply curve would get shifted up if there are increases in costs. And so you could think of the marginal cost curves in a lot of different individual markets, which is the supply curve being shifted to the left, which would lead to higher prices. And something that can happen, especially, and when we saw this in the 70s, if you have some kind of an oil crisis. So back in the 70s, I believe the OPEC cartel, they had much more power back then, and they basically cut their output of oil substantially, and that led to the oil prices jumping up substantially. And I mean, not many companies buy oil directly, but oil is important indirectly, even if you don't use it in your business, but you use gasoline. A lot of goods need to be transported, right? Coca-Cola, anything in a convenience store that needs to be shipped. And so if shipping costs increase by a lot, then we could see prices increase as well, right? So here's an example of demand pull inflation. We're just basically talking about a movement along the aggregate supply curve with aggregate demand shifting. So this increase in aggregate demand causes the price level to increase. Now, the Phillips curve is a graph that basically summarizes the inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation, which are the two economic evils. And from 1960 to 1972, the Canadian Phillips curve was relatively stable. But then from 1973 to 1982, the Canadian our Phillips curve shifted rightward, resulting in stagflation. And so stagflation is where you get, an increase in inflation and an increase in the unemployment. Really bad. You're getting more of both of the two economic evils. And then from 1983 to 2013, stagflation was reversed, but there was not really a constant Phillips curve emerging. So the relationship between inflation and unemployment isn't, all as simple as we tend to think it is. And that's, when we're thinking of generally this relationship, we usually tend to be thinking about just the demand pull inflation, but we can also have cost push inflation. And then, if you have cost push inflation, you can have prices increase even though you're in a recession. But normally in a recession, demand is low. That's the problem. And so you wouldn't expect inflation, but it could happen on the cost side, on the supply side of the economy. And so then you can have unemployment and inflation. So there is a relation, a negative relationship, but it can be confused, not so clear in the event of cost push inflation. So a Phillips curve looks like this. It's just an inverse relationship between the unemployment rate and inflation. So usually if inflation's high, the unemployment rate would be low. So if inflation is really high, then we should be hovering around our natural unemployment rate. If inflation is very low, that's more indicative of a recession, and so we could have a high unemployment rate. So the Phillips curve expresses the Keynesian belief in the fixed and predictable inverse relationship between these two. But it's just sort of focusing on demand pull inflation, not cost push inflation. When the economy moves from B to A, which may happen as the result of expansionary stabilization policies, right? If the Bank of Canada decides to increase the money supply, that stimulates the economy. We would have lower unemployment, but costs would be maybe some higher inflation. And then the other way around would be contractionary policies that would, work in the opposite. They're going to destimulate the economy, which could lead to higher unemployment. And that would be like a movement from B to C. If we look at the Phillips curve, so, that's just basically the old way to think about it is sort of a movement along the curve, but because of cost push inflation, the curve can actually shift. And so roughly, in these years, our Phillips curve was maybe roughly around here. You could see it's very rough. If you did a regression on this, by no means would you be getting, a very good fit. The 60s and 70s was here. And so a part of this shift could have been due to the the OPEC crisis. And then if you look at 1983 to 2013, if you plot them, you don't really get a clear negative relationship. So there's a lot of other things going on here on the cost side. Okay, so that's 1960 to 1972. We get roughly, a negative relationship here, roughly a negative relationship. But then, here, the trend was, we ended up getting much lower inflation, but we had higher unemployment. So, the new position of the Phillips curve isn't exactly clear. So the relationship between inflation and unemployment is a little more complicated when we start thinking of cost push inflation. So cost push inflation would be where you have something like this, where, you're at an initial short run equilibrium, and then something happens like, there's some cost in the economy that has increased. Remember, we draw the aggregate supply curve for fixed input costs. We're assuming that in the short run, they're not changing along the curve. And so anyways, if they do change, then you need to draw a new curve. And so here we're saying that the input prices have increased. So at any real GDP, the price level would have to higher for firms to want to offer that same amount for sale. And so in that case, clearly the input prices have increased. If the curve was below here, it would be the opposite story. And so when that happens, when the aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, we can see that prices go up, and then we also have a reduction in our real GDP. So we could be put into a recession just because of input prices change. And so when that happens, it's a bad combination where we have unemployment and inflation, and that's called stagflation. So in theory, the economy has a self-stabilizing tendency due to long-run movements in the aggregate supply curve. So if you think about being in a deep recession, then the economy will eventually self-adjust because wages should eventually fall. So Keynes, when he developed this model, was concerned about this idea because he was writing around the time of the Great Depression, and after 10 years when the recession started, unemployment rate was still high, and so clearly wages weren't adjusting to clear the labor market. There was still high unemployment. But, eventually wages should adjust, but it might just take a very, very long time. And you just from your personal experience working in the real world, it's firms don't typically tend to lower everyone's wages if business is bad, right? Wages tend to be fixed, and you see layoffs rather than the firm just paying everyone lower and keeping everyone. But eventually, that pressure would tend to push wages down. It could be, maybe the wage itself, but won't be pushed down too much, but maybe other things might be incorporated by businesses to reduce it. Like they could cancel year-end bonuses, maybe less breaks or something like that, depending on what your work. But there'd be a tendency for them to eventually fall, and then some companies might go out of business, and then the new companies that open will initially not pay a high wage, they'll pay a lower wage. There's a lot of stickiness, but eventually it would be eventually the labor market should clear where the wages are lower. And so if wages start to fall in the economy, that is basically a rightward shift in the aggregate supply curve. And so if we look at a diagram, so in this case, we have an inflationary gap, okay? And so what could happen here is that wages would tend to increase, right? Because of higher prices. And so that would shift the aggregate supply curve to the left. And it would, self-adjust back to potential output. If you're in a recession, the aggregate supply curve could shift to the right, eventually wages would fall, and then you would make your way back to potential output. So that's the idea of it just self-stabilizing. But again, Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead, meaning it could take a very long time for these adjustments to happen. So maybe it's better for the government to step in and try and stabilize the economy itself. It'll be much faster and there'll be less human misery. So these movements mean that the vertical line on the graph at the potential output can be interpreted as the economy's long-run aggregate supply curve. So because of this self-adjustment, we think that, in the long run, the economy will operate at potential output. And so we call that the long-run aggregate supply curve. And that amount, it's fixed, is based on real things like how much human resources we have, how much skills do we have, how much natural resources do we have, real physical things that determine how much we can produce. So basically, the long-run aggregate supply curve is showing all points consistent with a stable long-run equilibrium. But, in real life, the economy never gets a chance to settle into a long-run stable equilibrium. Instead, it is constantly being agitated by changes in prices, technologies, taxes, demographics, all sorts of things. And so the economy fluctuates between expansion and contraction in what's known as the business cycle. So we sort of hover around this long-run trend. So just to recap some of today's key points, the Bank of Canada manages the supply of money with the main goals of controlling inflation and stabilizing the economy near potential output. The Bank of Canada will use a contractionary tight monetary policy to reduce an inflationary gap, and this will have the effect of raising interest rates. It's making credit more expensive, so that's going to lead to lower borrowing and investment and shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. If we're in a situation where we have a recessionary gap, then the Bank of Canada will use loose monetary policy. This has the effect of reducing interest rates, which makes borrowing cheaper, and so that will stimulate the economy and shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. And the Bank of Canada conducts monetary policy through open market operations, which is buying and selling government bonds in conjunction with targeting the overnight rate. And that's the rate at which commercial banks borrow with each other. There's sort of this overnight market that's created because at the end of the day, some banks may have too much money or not enough money to cover the balances between the banks. And so, these two policies are used in conjunction, but the Bank of Canada really focuses on what that overnight rate should be, and then accommodates the money supply so that it gets to that rate. And we also talked about the two sources of inflation: demand pull and cost push. So in theory, there's an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. If the Bank of Canada tries to reduce inflation, it can lead to higher unemployment. However, that relationship doesn't always hold, especially when we start thinking of cost push inflation. So in theory, in the long run, economies should stabilize, but in reality, they tend to fluctuate around potential output in business cycles. Okay, so that's the end of our lecture for chapter 13. Here are some practice problems that you should try before the final exam. Okay, well, thanks for listening, and we will see you shortly for chapter 14.